Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a framework that honestly completely flips standard political assumptions right on their head. We're going to neutrally unpack the Economic Freedom Fighters, or the EFF's, Pan-African border policy. Now, this is a topic that's deeply complex, it's incredibly relevant today, and it's also pretty frequently misunderstood. So we're going to rely strictly on their source framework to map out exactly what they are proposing, how it actually functions in practice, and why they argue that a complete systemic overhaul is absolutely necessary. But before we really get into the weeds of their policy, I want you to consider something. Do stricter borders actually make us safer and more prosperous? It's a massive question, right? Usually our standard assumptions about immigration say, well, yes, build a wall, tighten the gates, and security naturally goes up. But today, we're going to look at how the EFF presents an alternative, systemic vision that challenges those standard assumptions head-on. All right, so here is our roadmap. We've broken this complex topic down into 6 impartial, easy-to-grasp areas: historical obligation, economics and security, humanitarian realities, fixing the labor market, xenophobia prevention, and finally, reimagining the status quo. Okay, let's kick things right off with Section 1, the historical moral obligation, and this concept of a moral debt. So think back for a second to the apartheid era. During that time, neighboring countries, places like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania, they sheltered ANC exiles and freedom fighters. And they did this at a really great cost to their own national security and their own economies. Now, fast forward to the present day. The EFF used the current tightening of borders, along with the deportation of the African diaspora by a black government today, as a literal betrayal of that past solidarity. For the EFF, South Africa owes a historical debt to the rest of the continent, and therefore has a profound moral obligation to be a home for all Africans. Moving right along, let's jump into Section 2. Economics and regional security, specifically looking at the AFCFTA and safety. The economic engine of this whole argument hinges on a pretty fascinating premise. You see, South Africa is already part of the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA. And this agreement is built on the idea that Africa simply grows faster when people, goods, and skills are able to move freely. The EFF makes the economic argument that rigid border enforcement directly undermines that very vision. By integrating the regional labor market, skills can flow freely to exactly where they're needed most. Entrepreneurs and investors aren't getting completely bogged down by endless red tape. And fundamentally, increasing intra-African trade actively reduces the continent's historical dependence on Western markets. Now, I know exactly what you might be thinking right now. You're looking at that economic model and asking, okay, sure, but what about security? It's totally natural to be skeptical anytime open borders and free movement are discussed. So let's pivot and look at the EFF's counterintuitive security argument. This is where we hit a really interesting paradox. The EFF argues that the current, heavily siloed system actually makes it way easier for criminals to exploit border gaps. Their vision suggests that regional integration actually improves security. How? Well, through a massive, centralized database with shared identity and biometric records across the entire continent. Think about it. If someone commits a crime in South Africa, they can't just casually flee across the border to Mozambique to escape the law, because those biometric records are actively shared. It's all about leveraging continental cooperation to permanently close the exact gaps that bad actors currently exploit. Okay. Zooming in from that big macro level of borders and databases, we arrive at Section 3. Addressing humanitarian realities and protecting the vulnerable. When we look at the actual human impact, the reality on the ground becomes super clear. Strict border enforcement usually hits the most vulnerable people the absolute hardest. We're talking about refugees who are fleeing violent conflict in the DRC, folks escaping the crushing economic collapse in Zimbabwe, or people running for their lives from the insurgency in Mozambique. According to the EFF, border crackdowns disproportionately harm these incredibly vulnerable populations, trapping them in transit rather than actually stopping career criminals like they're meant to. There's actually a really powerful quote straight from the EFF's founding document that hits the nail on the head. It says, "Denying a child schooling or a sick person a clinic because their parent crossed without papers is a humanitarian failure, not a security win." This fundamentally commits the party to protecting healthcare, education, and fair treatment for all immigrants, completely regardless of their legal status. It frames basic access as a non-negotiable human right, not just some conditional privilege that depends entirely on paperwork. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the local economy in Section 4, fixing the labor market and ending exploitation. Think about a major pain point right now in the local job market. Undocumented workers. Because they don't have official papers, they are heavily exploited. They're paid less, denied basic rights, and employers routinely use their undocumented status as leverage against them. Now, the current government's approach mainly focuses on trying to prosecute the employers who hire them, but the EFF takes a different angle. Their counterargument is that formalizing these undocumented workers is what actually stops the exploitation in its tracks. It grants them protected rights, and it levels the playing field for both foreign and South African workers, ensuring that nobody's wages can be undercut. Which brings us directly to Section 5, Xenophobia Prevention, and we really have to acknowledge a painful history here. We have to ground this policy in the grim reality of South Africa's recent past. In 2008, there was major xenophobic violence sweeping across the country. We saw a devastating resurgence of this violence again in 2015, and further heartbreaking episodes of mob violence in 2019. Recognizing the absolute gravity of these events kind of explains the extreme urgency behind the EFF's integration framework. The status quo isn't just inefficient, it is demonstrably dangerous and highly volatile. So, to psychologically shift this dangerous dynamic, the EFF introduces the concept of a documented community member. The party argues that if African migrants are officially documented, successfully integrated into communities, and their rights are formally recognized, it completely replaces that dehumanizing label of illegal. They transform from being faceless targets into recognized neighbors. The core argument here is that by removing the illegal label, you directly reduce the dehumanization that often fuels tragic mob violence in the first place. Let's bring all these distinct arguments together in our final segment, Section 6, Reimagining the Status Quo and Looking for Systemic Answers. So why propose such a massive alternative policy in the first place? Well, the EFF argues that the current legal gray zone serves absolutely nobody. Porous borders are selectively enforced, migrants are essentially trapped in this constant state of limbo and uncertainty, while South African workers remain completely unprotected from wage undercutting. Understanding this framework really matters to anyone observing international politics, because the stability of an entire continent's economy and its social fabric is tied directly to these border policies. The current system, at least in the EFF's view, simply fails to build the continental solidarity that Africa desperately needs to compete on the global stage. Ultimately, the EFF envisions a deeply systemic answer. They are focusing heavily on integration, shared databases, and documentation, rather than just relying on the traditional outdated methods of building more fences and endlessly increasing deportations. Neutrally speaking, whether you personally agree with their approach or you don't, it is undeniably an ambitious attempt at a complete systemic overhaul to address a continental status quo that is very clearly struggling. Which brings us to our final thought for today. Is regional integration the systemic key to Africa's future, or do the risks outweigh the rewards? It's a massive question, and obviously one that doesn't have an easy answer, but I really want to leave you pondering the deep complexities of the continent's future based on the framework we just explored. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.